Thank you, Kaz, for that very warm welcome, and I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Jaja Wurrung people, and acknowledge that we are on stolen land. And I'd like to make a personal apology for any shortcomings that I might have in working towards justice for Aboriginal people in this country. And also on behalf of my organisation, or the organisation that I'm employed by, Flat Out, I would like to say to any Aboriginal people present in the room that we will work harder to ensure justice for Aboriginal peoples of this country. Thank you to the Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre for hosting this forum, and to Art Justice for the opportunity to meet with all you wonderful local people. I want you to imagine that you're in a circle and not being lectured to by a group of people who I think largely come from Melbourne. And as a country person myself, I'm very aware of the sensitivities around being preached to by people who come from metropolitan areas. But I'm also aware that many of you may come from metropolitan areas, having made your tree change to Bendigo and region. I've had the pleasure of working with many of your local advocates, including Pete, Kaz, Bonnie, Steve, Anna, and Heather Osland, to name a few. Your community is very fortunate to have such a powerhouse of esteemed advocates and community workers working in and with and alongside your community. I've been around homelessness and community organisations for some time, as Kaz has said, and that 30 years is starting to grade a little because it does indicate what age I am. But I do have a strong intention to be around for another 30 years to continue to work in and around communities and encouraging community development approaches. And whilst Kaz has introduced me mainly by my title of managing Flat Out, and you may have an expectation that I'm going to talk more specifically about Flat Out, I actually wanted to talk more about the role of community organisations and members of community in working in and around law and order environments. And I'm going to speak to the topic, which is around the challenges for human rights advocates in communities working in environments where there are very heightened law and order agendas being propagated by politicians and then furnished further by media responses, in particular Herald Sun, which seems to have more say in our communities than communities themselves. So one of the things that strikes me about the Bendigo and wider region area is your commitment to working on social and economic justice issues, and in particular the growth of your TAFE and university sectors and other education sectors, and the importance of building strong education sectors within communities as a way of diverting resources away from policing and prisons and into what really matters, and that is the strengthening ends of the spectrum of infrastructure in communities. On topic, one of the first comments I want to make in relation to challenges for advocates is, and when I use the word advocate, I mean the very broad sense of advocate, not just organisations that are funded to undertake an advocacy role, but the role of individuals and communities as a whole in advocating. I think something which is being undermined within our communities, and not just within community organisations, but in individual people's right to speak, is around the independence of our voice as individuals and as communities. And one of the observations that I would make of the Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre is that it has worked hard to get that balance right between getting resources into the community for legal advice and assistance to people in the community, but also having a role and a voice in relation to community education and policy and law reform and systemic advocacy and social change. And I think as an organisation in the community of Bendigo, you're to be commended on that work. And I think what I would say about many community organisations that I've observed over the 30 years is that there's been a diminishing role of community organisations in speaking boldly, particularly when it's potentially going to put funding at risk. And I think organisations have become more self-serving and less serving of their communities, and more lured by funding than they are by the voice of their communities. And I really do think that is a major challenge for human rights advocacy in this country. It's about shifting that back to the original purpose of community organisations in providing an independent voice for communities and in encouraging individuals and members and groups of people in communities to maintain that independent voice. I think many organisations, even within the not-for-profit sector and NGO sectors, have become complicit in law and order agendas. And again, that gets back to funding opportunities for organisations to be complicit in law and order agendas and contributing in many ways to heightened fears within the community. And one of the, I'll give you one small example of that, and it's around the use of ice or crystal methamphetamine in communities where I think that there is considerable hype at the expense of a focus on what is a much greater issue, and that's the use of alcohol in our communities. And I do think that many organisations have fallen for the lure of money in relation to this issue and have actually jumped over or sidestepped a very important issue, which is alcohol. I think when we talk about law and order and its impact on communities, what's often disregarded is the fact that there are victims of law and order and criminal injustice. Some of the most disadvantaged Victorians are victims of these systems gone mad. To get through these systems and find justice requires effective and strident advocacy and self-advocacy. It's critical, and I mean critical because I mean often they are life and death situations where advocates really, I don't believe, have an option to walk away. They have to stay in the space and work through that space no matter how difficult and uncomfortable that space becomes to seek justice. Flat Out's view is in some ways contentious. As Phoebe will talk more about, we are what's called a prison abolition organisation, and we connect with a whole range of different organisations internationally around working toward a world without police and prisons, which might seem unachievable in the current context. But if we consider for a moment a vision to end homelessness, I don't think any one of us wants to dispense with that vision or that possibility that we could live in a community without homelessness. And I think it's equally right or and a good vision to have to work toward a community that might exist without the need for police and prisons. If you work, live or know someone with any of the following characteristics: homeless, poor, isolated, non-English speaking background, compromised mental and or physical health, intellectual disability, acquired brain injury, addiction, compulsive and or other impulsive behaviours, victims of violence, any forms of violence, histories of contact with child protection, out-of-home care and institutionalisation of any kind, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Vietnamese, or simply living on the wrong side of town or river or country, with high unemployment levels and low levels of education, chances are, if you know someone with any one of these characteristics, they will have had some kind of relationship with the policing and prison system in Victoria. Our sense of what we need to do as a community is not restricted to the role of community organisations and advocacy organisations and access to legal and other forms of justice. Our view is I'm losing a page here, Kaz, because I think I'm in danger of going over time. In tackling these issues, we think we need to look inside our communities and do a couple of practical things that can make a difference. And it's about shifting and reframing how we look at and work within our communities without a reliance on police and prisons and other community infrastructure which is said to be there to pick up the people who slip through the net or those people who come in contact with the policing and prison system. First and foremost, we need to take responsibility for supporting any person we see vulnerable to interactions with the criminal justice system. This includes family members, neighbours, friends and colleagues. We know we need to hold and act on this responsibility in all the settings that we occupy, homework and play. We must not rely on underfunded or poorly directed service systems to do the work of caring and being responsible communities. You know this well, as people living in a rural community, that you can't, service that's going to be the simple fix or the solution to community problems is not going to be there all of the time. So it is actually the role of everyone in the community to pick up this responsibility. And in any campaign in a rural community, it begins in your backyard. You can never be sure that the resources that you need will make their way out of the cities and into your communities. We need to think laterally about solutions to community problems that don't involve police and prisons as a primary response. Family violence is on most people's radar right now, or should be, along with all other forms of violence. But if our primary response is police and prisons, will we solve the problem of violence in our communities? I don't think so. We have to stand firm with our politicians and say enough is enough. Stop using law and order campaigning to garner votes. You know you are wreaking havoc on our communities. You have to stop right now. In the immediate future, we have to work on educating our communities and government and start peeling back some of the draconian and punitive changes in law over the past 2 years. In particular, the changes to suspended sentences and parole, which are currently spiralling policing and prison rates. In the last 10 years, imprisonment has gone up by 63%, and in the last year, 15%. We're giving more funding to more dysfunctional systems who are not going to solve the problem. It's important that we always read between the lines of law and order politics and not be afraid to stand up and refute the narrative that is spun by politicians in concert with the Herald Sun. Talk with your community members and leaders about what you can do as a community to help your community prosper. Look after your young people. It's so important to look after young people. If you see young people going under, support them, don't shun them. Don't rely on services that may or may not come. We all have the right to live violence-free lives. Policing and prisons are inherently expensive, always punitive. That's their core reason for being. And they are often violent institutions, and we cannot and must not rely on violence to fix violence. So again, I want to commend ARC for the great work that you do and your leadership, Peter, and everyone else who's involved in the ARC project, in your areas of community development and community education, making law and legal representation accessible to your communities, for drawing the connections between law and health and law and education, for supporting your community when they're on the wrong side of the road or river or law, for giving your community local news and events that refute the Herald Sun narrative and enable communities to draw their own conclusions. This is critical. If there's a community in Victoria that can show leadership on facing the challenges of being a human rights advocate in police and prison reform, it's this one. I wish you all the very best. Thank you.